Hello and welcome to the webinar Shaping the Future of Ingredient Innovation in a New Political Era. My name is Harini Venkataraman, Associate Research Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating and co-presenting today's session. Joining me for this discussion today is my colleague Elnis Shabani, analyst here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the box that you see on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all your questions that we can. If your question does not get answered, please do not hesitate to email us to questions@luxresearchinc.com, and we'll make sure to respond immediately. Also, at any point, if you experience technical difficulties such as a frozen screen, just simply refresh your browser and check if your internet connection is strong. All right, let's just dive right into the webinar today. Let's start with the snapshot. What you see on the left is the classic vibrant gummy bear, something which I really like a lot, colorful, enticing, but definitely using synthetic colors. And what you see on the right here is a new generation of confections. You have muted colors, you have a clean label product strategy going on there. The reality is that most products today still look like what's on the left, and what we're beginning to see is just a meaningful shift towards the right. And again, what's important to note is that it's just not going to change overnight. It's more so about recognizing that a transformation is underway. And to add to all of this, we're also seeing evolving policies, consumer concerns are definitely reshaping how ingredients are being formulated. And this is exactly what we're going to unpack in today's webinar, which will look at three key shifts reshaping ingredient innovation. First up, we're going to look at the dynamics that are changing. We'll be talking a bit about evolving regulations, policy changes across the globe impacting ingredient innovation. Next, we'll also cover a little bit about how companies are reformulating in response to this new and fragmented risk landscape. And I think that would span across regulations, supply chains, but also the consumer concerns, which I think is a valid and integral part of this webinar. And finally, we'll definitely share where we see the biggest opportunities and how you can stay ahead in this very fast and dynamic landscape. All right, let's look a little bit into the shifting dynamics. It's interesting to see that just within the past 6 months, mainly in the US, you've seen a number of different changes. If you look a little bit deeply here, I think the regulatory landscape has shifted just within the past 6 months. In January, the Department of Health and Human Services directed the FDA to revisit the self-affirmed GRAS pathway, signaling what could likely be a tighter scrutiny for new food ingredients, particularly the ones that involve synthetic biology, but also other up-and-coming emerging pathways. And if you look a little bit further down, I think in February, President Trump rescinded the executive order for biomanufacturing. I think that was a pretty big move. But also in April, we saw that the FDA already announced plans to phase out several petroleum-based synthetic dyes and really setting the stage for a larger scale reformulation. What it really underscores all of these developments is really how rapidly policy is becoming a central force in building your ingredient strategy. And of course, today we just started looking at the US, but the reality is that this is not just a US-centric story. And in fact, countries outside the US are also making different moves. As I mentioned, the moves are different from the US, which means the UK, for example, is making bold regulatory moves post-Brexit. Singapore continues to be an innovation-friendly nation, specifically for novel foods. I think it's still a very interesting country to think about for a lot of the go-to-market strategy. And also South Korea recently passed the Synthetic Biology Promotion Act, which will set into effect sometime in 2026. And what this policy is likely to do is also really favor biomanufacturing of chemicals, ingredients, and investment infrastructure. Think about all of those biofoundries that may be essential for scaling up some of these ingredients. And this really brings us to this critical point, thinking about the shift in go-to-market thinking. What we see is that startups can no longer default to launching in US. I think it used to be the case. I think from Lux, we have looked at a number of different startups over the past 5 years. I think these startups are strategically assessing where approvals are accelerating and where consumer needs are actually aligning with local frameworks. So it's definitely a big change. And kind of expanding on what I just mentioned, I think we're seeing this change manifest in itself like a cycle of influence in the global landscape. So if you look at what the political and the policy-driven volatility in the U.S., I think it's really been shifting the epicenter of venture-driven innovation from the U.S. now. I think, especially from a more stringent policy standpoint, I think the U.S. is becoming more like an EU. EU is still conservative and it often has very high regulatory standards, and we continue to see that. But the interesting fact is that APAC is now really emerging as a hub of adaptive manufacturing, but also the presence of like cheap feedstock, also the processing methodologies is really pushing a lot of companies to actually think about APAC as a hot zone for innovation. So, with all of these changes happening, I think it begs the question, if you were to think about a resilient strategy, whether you're an ingredient player, whether you're a CPG, food beverage player, uh, what do you actually think about when you are trying to innovate across markets, across risk categories, but also this regulatory framework that I was just mentioning, how that's pretty, fast changing across the world. Think this is where I think my colleague Elnis is going to bring in some very interesting, ideas around not just the ingredients, but literally thinking about an innovation playbook for CPGs and other type of, companies where we'll look at a bit on what's driving demand, how technologies are evolving, but also how players are actually making use of that, both corporate strategy, bigger players, but also how smaller startups are, emerging out of this. So let's take it away.
Thanks, Harini. Yeah, so far we looked at how policy is shifting and how that shift would drive changes in innovation. From those policy shifts, we see that three signals can drive innovation changes. One can be the clean label getting functional, meaning that any move towards clean label natural ingredients means that it has to work with real world formulations and has to pass that functionality protocols. GRAS and safety resetting the shelf life game with GRAS scrutiny coming up in the US, consumers demanding more clean label foods. We are seeing a great pressure from corporates moving towards multi-factor shelf life extension solution. And last but not least, sugar reduction strategies, not anymore about using alternative sweeteners, but it's becoming a structural challenges. On the right side here in this slide, we have what we call here Lux-Tech signal, which is an indicator for innovation momentum. It looks upon multiple factors, including number of papers and patents or VC investments that goes toward a certain technology. Here, for this webinar, we're looking at three broad categories of food ingredients being colorants, preservatives, and sugars, sweeteners. And we'll take a look at text signal for each of these categories. Let's just start with food colorants. And here in the text signal on the right side, we're seeing that a couple of years ago, like 10 years ago, we saw a big surge in innovation, but most recently we are seeing a kind of a plateau. It seems like the innovation baseline is still high, but it's kind of now in a more stabilized phase. This doesn't mean that innovation in food colorant is not relevant anymore. The signal here is that early introduction of some natural alternatives such as betaline plant extracts, the early wins around those were realized, but then the scale up and cost constraints now are kind of stalling the commercialization of these ingredients. So R&D is really shifting towards addressing some of those shortcomings, some of those functionality and performance kind of projects. And that's why we're seeing a very steady incremental shift in innovation around colorants. As we see the innovation momentum going, it's interesting to see like where these innovations are happening. And here you see a landscape of different technologies within food colorants, starting from extraction, which means extracting these bioactive ingredients from natural sources such as betalain, beetroot. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have more emerging technologies such as precision fermentation, microbial biosynthesis, where a lot of these technology categories, they are good in meeting the functionality needs for these colorants, but they are still under a lot of scrutiny around regulations, and cost and scale up is also a challenge for them. Taking a look at the market map for different players within this space, on one side of the spectrum, we have bigger players, established players like Givaudan, ADM, offering legacy ingredients, but they are also offering some natural uh, alternatives as well. We have the plant extract companies such as Lycored that are offering some alternative technologies such as encapsulation for improving the functionality of some of those plant extracts, as they oftentimes lack those functionalities similar to their synthetic counterparts. And then we have the most emerging players, innovators such as Chromologics, Phytalone, who are using fermentation, precision fermentation technology for their ingredients. In terms of how some of the bigger players like Givaudan are interacting with these emerging innovations, let's take a look at this one case study here, where we are seeing that the CVC arm of Reach Products, a CPG company, is investing in Phytalone, a precision fermentation startup company. What's interesting about this case study is the nature of these, the nature of the company involved. Rich Products is not a common ingredient company, it's a CPG player. And through this investment, we're seeing that they're also co-developing products with Phytalon, which is a great, I would say, example of how more downstream players can invest in some of these innovative solutions on ingredient side. Moving away from color in the space to the preservative, the next category of ingredients, looking at the text signal really quickly here, we saw surge in momentum. Momentum was growing steadily over the years, and most recently we are seeing a dip here. And when we dig deeper, looking at some patent trends and publication trends, we figured that this dip here is not an indicator of innovation going away or fading away. It's how the nature of innovation is now changing. There is less hype, less innovators coming up in the market, and I must say, less innovative solutions or ingredient introduced. Most innovation activities are focused on making what's already existing work, make them more functional, blending different ingredients together to get a synergistic effect. And that itself is a reason for reduced number of patents or VC investment, but innovation is definitely ongoing within this category as well. Just taking a look at the broad landscape of different technology within a shelf life extension solution, must say that shelf life extension is not anymore about just additives. Other alternative technologies are also on the market, given that there is a broad range of products available, ranging from fresh produce all the way to packaged goods. Some other alternative technologies that are also relevant to this category includes edible coating, for example, for fresh produce, or active packaging recently is gaining a lot of momentum as a very clean solution that kind of passively extends shelf life without adding new ingredients inside to the food formulation. Taking a look at where some of these players exists within this landscape, we see that for preservatives specifically, the landscape is majorly dominant by established players such as Corbion, Cargill, offering their legacy ingredients, but also offering some natural alternatives such as plant extracts, fermentates, cultured sugar. Um, Very few startup players are active within this space, and most innovations are focused around, I would say, in the startup front, focused around good bacteria, bacteriophages, and those kind of solutions. But still, the space is dominant by bigger players. In terms of how bigger players are innovating within this category, let's take a look at this case study by Corbion. They recently introduced an ingredient for shelf life extension, which is based on a cultured wheat product. And unique about these technologies, two aspects. One is that cultured sugar is very clean label. You don't need to include preservative name. It can simply be cultured sugar, which is very consumer friendly, I would say. And another aspect is that Corbion is emphasizing a lot about sensory properties of the food, and their ingredient is not going to change the sensory properties, creating any aftertaste, meaning that this is also a very critical point for when you're innovating for your shelf life extension solutions. A lot of solutions such as plant extract can affect the sensory properties, can create aftertaste, which may not make them suitable for a broad range of product categories. So innovations really focus on these aspects. Moving from preservative space to our last category being sweeteners. Taking a look at the text signal here, we're seeing that innovation baseline is high, but we're also seeing some volatility, and must say that this volatility, especially around 2021 and after, the surge in momentum was actually driven by the rise of some innovative solutions such as rare sugars, sweet proteins, or precision fermentation players. But the dip in the recent years, uh, again, this is not because there is the interest is fading. It's just because companies are starting to really realize the real problems being commercial and regulatory aspects of these ingredients. For example, a scrutiny around GRAS approvals and also cost and scale, as I mentioned. These are some of the areas that is hitting the innovation within this category. Just taking a look at different technology landscape basically for natural sweeteners. On one side we have rare sugars such as allulose, which is very close to sucrose in terms of functionality. Then we also have sweet proteins produced through technology like precision fermentation, and which can offer very significant sweetness at very low concentrations. And then we also have some alternative technologies such as bio-based stevia and membrane filtration developed by different players, which kind of reflects how players are kind of pushing for more scalable and cost-effective routes to natural sweetness, basically. Taking a look at the market map for different players within this space, for each categories, we have small players and also larger corporates as well. For example, within sweet proteins, we have players such as Ambrosio Bio, Banyomos, who are scaling up enzymatic production. We also have on the sweet protein side players that are trying to scale up their precision fermentation solutions, such as Sweegen being a little bit ahead in the game, but Amoi Proteins and also Nomad Biosciences. And then we also have some bigger players such as Coca-Cola, Danone, Nestle, using membrane filtration technologies to kind of reduce sugar consumption in some of their beverage lines. In terms of how bigger players in this landscape are adopting some of the innovative solutions such as sweet proteins. Let's take a look at this one case study together where Ingredient is partnering with Obli, being one of the first players bringing sweet proteins to the market using precision fermentation. Through this partnership, the two companies are trying to co-develop basically sweetener systems. So from this case, I think 2 points really stands up, which is that precision fermentation is now in the commercial deployment phase. And the fact that sweeteners and alternative basically sweeteners is not just about a single sweetener anymore. They are doing blended systems using some innovative solutions combined with some of the more legacy type of ingredients such as bio-based stevia to kind of overcome the limitations of those ingredients. And that's a great example of how bigger players are partnering with more smaller players on the innovative side to make these sweetener systems kind of work together. Overall, uh, the question now would be, how do we take these ingredient decisions under regulatory pressure and kind of make them work globally? Let's take a look at this regional innovation playbook that kind of really tie everything together. On the right, you'll see a table comparing the regulatory landscape across different regions, US, EU, and APAC. The colors here show how strict and how fluid each of these regions is when it comes to getting new ingredients approved. And let's just start with the US. US is kind of moving from green to yellow, and that signals a clear shift. The challenge here isn't just regulation, it's actually unpredictability. State level bans are increasing, and we are seeing vastly different rules from California to Florida. So innovation here needs to be proactive, not reactive, and you have to plan for a state by state variation and kind of create flexibility into your formulation strategies early on. The EU, by contrast, is kind of rigid but predictable, same as always, with a focus on clean label, transparency, and well-defined approval processes. If you know the rules, you can design to meet them. Looking at the APAC region, which is kind of, I would say, more mixed. Countries like Singapore are leaning into innovation, especially in novel foods, but others are kind of slower with less transparency. So success here really depends on local partnerships and building trust, essentially adapting to the pace and politics of each of these markets. And the overall takeaway here would be that ingredient innovation now lives in a fractured regulatory world, and your strategy has to reflect that. What works in one region may not work in another region. And this playbook overall will give you a framework for building regionally aware and regulation ready innovation from the start. And lastly, to basically wrap it up, here are three key takeaways that reflect not just what we've shown, but also what brands need to kind of act on now. First, ingredient innovation no longer operates in a unified global system. We are now in a fractured regulatory world, and the US in particular is shifting very fast from a permissive stance to a more restrictive, fragmented one, especially with estate level bans emerging very rapidly. And second, in this environment, formulation strategies have to evolve. It's not enough to swap one sweetener or colorant for another. You need holistic reformulation approaches that kind of respond to new regulatory, functional, and consumer pressure all at once. And that means aligning ingredients not only with what's technically possible, but also with what's acceptable in each of the markets that we discussed. And third would be winning here really requires region-specific innovation playbooks. There is no one size fits all anymore, and you have to build the strategies that account for readiness, for risk, and your ability to reformulate quickly. That's what we laid out in our kind of previous slide in the playbook, and that's what's going to stand out leaders in the next wave of ingredient innovation. And that concludes our webinar today. Thank you for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Elnis. We'll now be taking questions. So if you have any questions on the presentation, please type them in the questions box. Just looking at the questions coming in here. I think that's a pretty interesting one about that, regulations that you brought up, Elnis. So the question is, how do you think ingredient companies should prioritize between short-term reformulation opportunities versus like longer-term innovation bets, specifically for areas like synthetic biology or precision fermentation, especially with all of this changes in regulations?
That's a great question, Harini. And here I should say that I think developers really need to have a dual track kind of a strategy. As you mentioned, the rising scrutiny around innovation, consumer demand around clean label, and all of this pressure really is urging companies to kind of adopting a short-term strategy for choosing natural ingredients, clean label ingredients. And those short-term technologies that we discussed here, as an example, for colorants can be plant extracts that already exist or kind of commercialized. But the major drawback is that they sometimes do not meet the functionalities such as heat stability, pH stability, etc. And that's why companies need to have a dual track strategy where they also focus for a longer term, focus on innovative solutions such as synthetic biology tools, precision fermentation as an example, as technologies that can create ingredients with those desired functionalities. Right now, they are under they still need to go through regulatory approvals, especially in markets like Europe. But down the line, once they can meet those regulatory approvals, they are closer to a scale up, and cost is kind of in parity with other alternatives. Those have great potentials, and companies cannot really risk on ignoring those solutions. So they really need to have this dual track strategy to kind of as a short-term solutions versus longer-term solution.
Very interesting. So pretty much like build your own toolbox, right? I think some of the tools would be deployed in the near term versus like, be prepared
Exactly.
for what's going to change in the longer term. Another one is more related to like specifically food and beverage companies, right? And you brought up this region-specific innovation playbook. The question is about like how can CPGs really be adaptable to rapid policy changes without overstretching some of the R&D and regulatory resources? I think that's a very interesting question coming from like the downstream companies.
No, that's a great question. Absolutely. I think one point that we kept bringing up during today's presentation was that global regulatory harmonization is kind of dead now, and companies need to really realize that and create their model based on that. Agility is now really important, and companies really, brands really need to kind of adopt I would say, kind of a modular and flexible development model, that these models should accommodate local policy, consumer preferences, and also some of these regulatory approval timelines. And overall, I think this model should have a couple of characteristics that I can think of. One would be that they really need to diversify their ingredient portfolio, cannot over rely on one ingredient and ignore others. So diversification is really important. Other important aspect I can think of is really regulatory radar system. It can be done in-house, but it can also be done through third party, and really they really need to keep track of what's changing now and what's going to change in the future. So that's also very important. And the last aspect that I can think of would be that partnership, external partnership is really important, not just here, but overall. Here is specifically very important because given all of these shifts and changes, and companies need to be agile, they need to partner up with other, I don't know, ingredient suppliers, startup players, as you mentioned, and even regulatory consultants to really stay up to date with everything, and very prepared to all of these rapidly kind of changing environment.
Absolutely. And I think that's why at Lux, I think we're looking also at the human-centric innovation, right? I think this is a great example for ingredient innovation. Technology readiness is one part of the game, but then having that, let's say, how does it all tie into the regulatory consumer perception? I think it matters a lot. So yeah, the regional playbooks definitely stand out there. Now, I
So,
think that's all the time that we have today for questions. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all the attendees today. After leaving the webinar, you'll be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation, and we appreciate any feedback you have to improve our future webinars. So please take a moment and also check out some of our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
thank you.